Your saliva is boiling on your tongue right now. You just don't know it yet. Because in deep space, it starts at second 1. And you are unconscious by second 12. If you're the kind of person who needs to know exactly what is happening to your body right now, and what would happen to it the second that changed, take 1 second to subscribe before we begin. What comes next, nobody in your life has ever told you. Now, let's start the clock. Before we talk about what deep space does to you, we need to talk about what is happening to you right now, in this moment, as you read or hear these words. Because the answer is extraordinary. Right now, your diaphragm is contracting. It is pulling downward, expanding the cavity inside your chest, creating a slight drop in pressure inside your lungs relative to the air outside. That pressure difference, tiny, invisible, unmeasurable to your senses, is forcing air through your nose or mouth and into your lungs. You are not doing this consciously. Your brainstem is doing it. It has been doing it since roughly the moment you were born, approximately every 4 seconds, about 20,000 times a day, without you ever having to think about it. At the same time, your heart is contracting. It has been doing this roughly 70 times per minute every minute of every day of your life. Right now, at this exact moment, it is squeezing blood through roughly 60,000 miles of blood vessels inside your body, enough tubing to circle the Earth more than twice, delivering oxygen to about 37 trillion individual cells. Each of those cells is performing hundreds of chemical reactions every second. Taking in glucose and oxygen. Producing energy. Exporting waste. Communicating with neighboring cells through electrical signals and chemical messengers. Repairing their own DNA when radiation or chemical damage occurs, which it does, constantly, even sitting here. The protein machines inside your cells are folding themselves into 3-dimensional shapes that determine whether a cell lives or dies, whether a gene is expressed or silenced, whether your immune system flags something as a threat or lets it pass. All of this is happening right now. All of it happening automatically. All of it happening because Earth, this specific planet, with its specific atmospheric pressure, its specific gravitational pull, its specific magnetic field, its specific temperature range, is providing the exact baseline conditions that your biology has been calibrated to expect for the entirety of its 300,000-year evolutionary history. Change any one of those conditions. Just one. And the machine breaks. Not gradually. Not with warning. Instantly. Catastrophically. Irrevocably. That is what deep space is. It is not just the absence of air. It is the removal of every single baseline condition your body assumes will always be there. All of them. All at once. In less than 1 second. And what happens to your body in those seconds is something the movies have never been willing to show you. Because it isn't dramatic in the way Hollywood wants drama to be. It isn't slow and peaceful and full of last words. It is physics. And physics doesn't negotiate. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start at the very thing that makes everything else possible. Pressure. Right now, every square inch of your body is under approximately 14.7 pounds of force. That number, 14.7 pounds per square inch, is what we call 1 atmosphere of pressure. It is the weight of the entire column of air above you, stacked from where you're sitting all the way up to the edge of space, pressing down on every surface it contacts. That sounds crushing. Over 20 tons of total force pressing on the average adult body surface. And yet you feel nothing. You feel absolutely nothing because that pressure is pressing in from every direction simultaneously, above, below, left, right, front, back, and your body is pressing back out from the inside with exactly the same force. Equilibrium. Your blood is pressurized. Your tissues are pressurized. The gases dissolved in your blood, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, are dissolved at a concentration precisely calibrated to 1 atmosphere of external pressure, the same way carbon dioxide stays dissolved in a sealed bottle of soda, held in liquid form by the pressure of the sealed environment. Your lungs work because of pressure gradients. Your circulatory system works because of pressure gradients. Your kidneys filter blood because of pressure gradients. Even the most basic process of nutrient exchange in your capillaries, where blood delivers oxygen to cells and picks up carbon dioxide, depends on precise pressure differentials between the inside of capillaries and the surrounding tissue. Every biological process in your body that involves a fluid moving anywhere is driven, at least in part, by pressure. Remove it, and every single one of those processes breaks simultaneously. Not after a few minutes. Not after a few seconds. In the first fraction of a second of exposure to deep space vacuum. That is the thing nobody talks about when they describe what space does to the human body. It is not one thing failing. It is everything failing at once. Each failure accelerating the others in a cascade that is complete and irreversible before your brain has time to register what is happening. You won't feel most of it. You will be unconscious too quickly. But we are going to walk through every second of it together. Because you deserve to understand exactly how close the line is between the world that keeps you alive and the void that doesn't. Before we reach the moment of exposure, there is something else you need to understand. Something that makes the story even more extreme than most people realize. Your body doesn't just depend on pressure. It depends on a very specific combination of conditions that happen to exist on Earth and almost nowhere else we know of in the observable universe. Let's list them. First, atmospheric pressure of roughly 1 atmosphere. Your biology requires this for reasons we've discussed. Go above it, like deep sea divers experience, and you get a different set of problems. Go below it, as an altitude sickness at high elevation, and things start to fail. Remove it entirely, as in a vacuum, and everything fails at once. Second, oxygen at a partial pressure of roughly 2.9 pounds per square inch. Oxygen is about 21% of Earth's atmosphere. At sea level, that 21% translates to just under 3 psi of oxygen partial pressure. Your lungs need at least 2.5 psi of oxygen to function. Below that threshold, you develop hypoxia. The cells of your brain, which consume 20% of your body's oxygen despite being only 2% of your body weight, begin to fail first. Third, a temperature range between roughly -10 and 50 degrees Celsius. Your core body temperature needs to stay within a few degrees of 37 degrees Celsius for metabolic processes to work. Too cold, and enzyme activity slows to a stop. Too hot, and proteins denature, unfolding into useless tangles. The enzymes that drive your heart, your brain, your immune system, all of them require thermal stability. Fourth, protection from radiation. Earth's magnetic field deflects high-energy charged particles from the sun and from galactic sources. Earth's atmosphere. Absorbs X-rays and gamma rays. The ozone layer blocks ultraviolet radiation that damages DNA. Without these 3 layers of protection operating simultaneously, the radiation environment of deep space would overwhelm your DNA repair mechanisms within hours and cause acute radiation sickness within days. 5th, gravity. This one is slower acting than the others, but it is real. Your cardiovascular system, your skeletal system, your vestibular system, your immune system, all of them require gravity to function as designed. Remove it for 6 months, and 1 in 3 astronauts return with measurable vision. Impairment from fluid pressure building in their skulls. Bones lose up to 1.5% of their mass every month. Muscle fibers can shrink by 1/3 in less than 2 weeks. Remove all 5 of these conditions at once, which is what happens the instant you are exposed to deep space, and your body does not have a graceful failure mode. It does not shut down gently. It breaks in multiple ways simultaneously, each failure making the others worse, in a cascade that is complete before most people would even have time to scream. That is what we are about to walk through. Second by second. Starting now. Let's set the scene. You are in space. In a suit, on a spacewalk, or, in the scenario we're using for this video, unprotected. The exact cause doesn't matter for the biology. What matters is the moment. The last moment where everything is still working. Your heart is beating. Your diaphragm is moving. Your blood is carrying oxygen to 37 trillion cells. Your brain is processing the visual field in front of you, the sounds, the sensations, the proprioceptive sense of where your limbs are in space. You are, for this last moment, entirely human. Entirely alive in the fullest biological sense. The pressure around you is 1 atmosphere. 1 atmosphere of pressure is the only thing standing between you and everything we are about to describe. And then it is gone. 0 seconds. Exposure begins. The moment exposure begins, the pressure around your body drops from 1 atmosphere to essentially 0. Not gradually. Instantaneously. This is not a metaphor. This is not an exaggeration. The drop is immediate and complete. You go from being surrounded by 14.7 pounds of force per square inch to being surrounded by essentially nothing in less time than a camera shutter can open and close. In that fraction of a second, your body begins to recognize, at a purely physical level, not a conscious one, that the equilibrium it has maintained for your entire life has been destroyed. The gases dissolved in your blood begin to come out of solution. The moisture on every exposed surface of your body begins to vaporize. The air in your lungs begins to expand. None of this has reached your brain yet. Your neurons fire too slowly for that. The signals from your tissues haven't had time to travel through your nervous system and be interpreted as sensation. In this first fraction of a second, your body is breaking and you don't know it yet. 1 second in. Here is the first thing you would feel, if you were conscious and had time to register it. The moisture on your tongue begins to boil. Not because it's hot. Because of the lack of pressure. Water's boiling point depends on the pressure around it. At sea level, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. At the summit of Everest, where pressure is about 1/3 of sea level, water boils at around 70 degrees Celsius. In the near vacuum of space, water boils at body temperature. 37 degrees Celsius. The same temperature as the inside of your mouth right now. The saliva on your tongue, the moisture on the inside of your lips, the fluid coating your airway, all of it is now at a temperature well above its new boiling point. It begins to evaporate. Not slowly, like sweat drying on skin. Rapidly. A flash transition from liquid to vapor. We know this from a real event. On December 14, 1966, a NASA engineer named Jim LeBlanc was testing a spacesuit prototype in a vacuum chamber at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. During the test, his pressurization hose became disconnected. The pressure inside his suit dropped from 3.8 psi to 0.1 psi, near vacuum, in approximately 10 seconds. LeBlanc later described his last conscious memory before he passed out. "As I stumbled backwards," he said, "I could feel the saliva on my tongue starting to bubble just before I went unconscious. And that's the last thing I remember." The saliva on his tongue started to bubble. He survived. He was repressurized in 87 seconds. He woke up with nothing but an earache. Full recovery. But those words, "the saliva on my tongue starting to bubble," are the only first-hand human account we have of what it feels like to be exposed to near vacuum. And the last sensation LeBlanc experienced before losing consciousness was his own body fluids beginning to phase change into vapor inside his mouth. At the same time, the moisture on the surface of your eyes is doing the same thing. The tear film that keeps your corneas lubricated, a layer about 7 micrometers thick, begins to evaporate. Your vision would blur and tear within moments, though you won't have long to experience that. The moisture in your nasal passages is vaporizing. The mucus lining your airway is beginning to desiccate. The lining of your throat, the delicate epithelial cells that protect your airway from the outside environment, are losing their moisture. 1 second in. And we haven't even gotten to the blood yet. 2 seconds in. Underneath your skin, inside your blood vessels, inside your tissues, the dissolved gases are doing what the carbon dioxide in that sealed soda bottle does the moment you crack the cap. They are coming out of solution. The process is called ebulism. It is the formation of gas bubbles in bodily fluids due to a sudden drop in ambient pressure. In technical terms, when the partial pressure of dissolved gases exceeds the ambient pressure, the gases nucleate into bubbles at any available site, a defect on a vessel wall, the surface of a cell membrane, a junction between tissues. In practical terms, your blood is beginning to foam. Not in a slow, orderly way. Not bubble by bubble. Simultaneously throughout your entire circulatory system, wherever dissolved nitrogen and oxygen and carbon dioxide can find a nucleation site, bubbles are forming. Your skin begins to swell. The subcutaneous gases, the dissolved gases in the fluid immediately beneath your skin, are expanding. This is a measurable, physical expansion. In documented animal experiments and the rare human cases involving partial vacuum exposure, the swelling is visible. The body expands noticeably, like a body being inflated from within. This is sometimes called ebulism syndrome. The 2013 review in Aerospace Medicine and Human Performance that examined every available animal and human exposure to vacuum confirmed that swelling occurs rapidly and consistently across all subjects. At the same time, if you were holding your breath, if your glottis was closed and you were trying to hold air inside your lungs, the air in your lungs would be attempting to expand. Your lungs contain roughly 6 liters of air at normal pressure. In a vacuum, that air would try to expand dramatically. The tissue of your lungs, delicate, thin-walled alveoli designed to exchange gases across a thin membrane, not to contain explosive pressure differentials, would begin to tear. This is barotrauma. The same mechanism that kills scuba divers who hold their breath while surfacing too quickly, but orders of magnitude more severe. The pressure differential between the inside of your lungs and the outside of your body would be 1 full atmosphere, 14.7 psi. Lung tissue tears at a fraction of that. If you were exhaling, if your airway was open, as training tells astronauts it must be, the air would rush out. Your lungs would deflate rapidly and completely. The continuous expansion of gases from your blood into the airway would keep pulling more material out, drawing vapor and gas from the deeper tissues of your respiratory system upward and out. 2 seconds in. Your blood is foaming. Your skin is swelling. Your lungs are either tearing or deflating, depending on whether you had the instinct or training to keep your airway open. The moisture from every surface in your respiratory system is evaporating. And your brain still hasn't received enough signal to tell you anything is wrong. 6 seconds in. Your heart is still beating. It doesn't know what's happening outside. It received no memo. It is still doing exactly what it has been doing for your entire life, contracting rhythmically, pushing blood outward through arteries, receiving it back through veins. But the blood it is now pushing is different from the blood it was pushing 6 seconds ago. The gas bubbles forming in your veins and arteries are not passive passengers. They occupy volume. They compress against vessel walls. They coalesce into larger bubbles at junctions and bends in your circulatory system. And as they grow and accumulate, they create obstructions. Your blood is beginning to behave less like a fluid and more like a foam. And foam does not flow efficiently through the narrow channels of capillaries. It blocks. It stalls. It backs up. Tissues that were receiving oxygen 6 seconds ago are now not receiving it. The gas emboli, the bubbles, are acting like clots, starving downstream tissue of the nutrients and oxygen it needs to survive. Your heart is working harder, sensing increased resistance in the vascular system. It speeds up. But the problem is not force. The problem is that the medium it is pumping is no longer behaving like a liquid. If you could see inside a vein right now, you would see something that looks like the inside of a bottle of beer after someone has shaken it hard. White. Foam. Bubbles everywhere. A fluid that was perfectly clear and red and functional 6 seconds ago now churning and foaming and beginning to fail. 6 seconds in. 10 seconds in. Your brain is now running on the oxygen that was already dissolved in the bloodstream before exposure began. No new oxygen is arriving. The lungs are no longer functioning as gas exchangers, they are either deflated or filling with foam, or both. No oxygen is crossing the pulmonary membrane. No carbon dioxide is being exported. The brain is the most oxygen-hungry organ in your body. It weighs about 1.4 kilograms, roughly 2% of your body weight. It consumes 20% of your body's oxygen at rest. And it cannot buffer oxygen deprivation. It cannot run on reserves the way muscles can. When the oxygen is gone, the brain goes very quickly. The sequence is this. First, the visual cortex begins to fail. Your peripheral vision narrows. The edges of your visual field go dark. This is called tunnel vision, and it is one of the first signs of cerebral hypoxia, oxygen starvation of the brain. Pilots who experience G-force-induced loss of consciousness describe exactly the same sequence. The edges of the visual field close and like curtains drawing shut. Then hearing starts to go. The auditory processing centers are more resilient than the visual cortex, but not by much. Sounds begin to dull. The quality of hearing changes. Things sound muffled, distant. Your proprioception, your sense of where your limbs are in space, begins to fail. Coordination deteriorates. If you are trying to do anything purposeful, trying to grab a handle or activate a switch, your hands would no longer cooperate. The fine motor pathways in your motor cortex are failing. Your executive function, the frontal lobe processes that allow you to reason, plan, make decisions, override instinct, those go early. Higher cognitive functions require the most oxygen. The brain shuts down from the top down, from the most complex to the most basic. 10 seconds in. The edges of your world are going dark. 12 seconds. You are unconscious. This is consistent with every documented human and animal exposure to vacuum conditions. The 2013 Aerospace Medicine Review, the most comprehensive analysis of vacuum exposure data available, found that loss of consciousness occurred within 10 seconds across all subjects. Jim LeBlanc lost consciousness after approximately 14 seconds, but his exposure was partial vacuum. The suit was not at true zero pressure. Full vacuum would be faster. The British pilot who experienced rapid decompression of his aircraft at altitude during World War II and survived described losing consciousness so quickly that he had no memory of the transition. One moment he was aware. The next moment he was not. No warning. No period of confusion or slow deterioration. A clean cut from consciousness to unconsciousness. At 12 seconds into full vacuum exposure, you are now unconscious. You will feel nothing that follows. But we are going to keep going. Because the universe does not stop working on your body just because you have stopped experiencing it. Take a second. Type second 12 in the comments if you're still with me. Because what I'm about to describe next is the part that nobody covers. And it's the part that changes everything about how you think about the human body and its relationship with this planet. You are unconscious. Your heart is still beating, weakly, pushing foamy blood through an increasingly blocked circulatory system. Your neurons are still firing, but in a disorganized way. The highly coordinated, purposeful activity of a conscious brain is gone, replaced by the erratic electrical storms that accompany oxygen deprivation. The swelling continues. The gas bubbles beneath your skin are still expanding. Your body is visibly larger than it was 30 seconds ago. The tissues around your joints, your face, your abdomen are distended. The technical term is anasarca, generalized swelling throughout the body. In the case of vacuum exposure, it happens within the first 30 seconds of exposure and it is profound. Animal experiments have documented this. Consistently. The subjects inflate visibly, like balloons being slowly filled. You are not exploding. This is a common misconception from science fiction. Human skin is tough. It holds. The connective tissue and fascia and dermis that make up your skin are far more elastic and resilient than most people realize. You will not rupture. You will not burst. What you will do is expand. Stretched internally by the gases expanding within your tissues, until you look like a person who has been profoundly, grotesquely swollen. The moisture loss continues. Your eyes, open or closed, are desiccating. The corneas are losing their protective tear film. The mucous membranes of your mouth and nose and throat are drying. The water vapor from your respiratory system is still flowing outward, drawn by the pressure differential between the inside of your body and the vacuum outside it. Your blood pressure is crashing. The heart is trying, but the combination of foaming blood and blocked capillaries and depleted volume, water vapor leaving through every exposed surface, is overwhelming its capacity. 30 seconds in. Brain damage from oxygen deprivation is beginning. Not reversible damage yet. Not at 30 seconds. But the neurons in your cerebral cortex are beginning to experience metabolic distress. They are running low on ATP, the energy molecule that powers neural firing. The ionic gradients that allow neurons to fire are collapsing as the sodium-potassium pumps that maintain them run out of energy. The most oxygen-hungry neurons in your brain are beginning to die. 1 minute. Brain damage from oxygen deprivation is now irreversible. This is the medical threshold that defines prognosis for hypoxic injury. At 60 seconds without oxygen supply to the brain, the damage that has occurred cannot be undone even with immediate repressurization and 100% oxygen therapy. The neurons in your cerebral cortex, the most evolutionarily recent part of your brain, responsible for conscious thought, language, personality, memory, everything that makes you specifically you, have been starved of oxygen for nearly a minute. In that time, they have exhausted their ATP reserves, the ionic pumps have failed, the cell membranes have depolarized uncontrollably, and the electrochemical imbalances that result trigger a cascade of excitotoxicity, a process in which neurons overstimulate themselves to death, releasing glutamate that damages neighboring neurons in an expanding wave of cellular destruction. Even if someone repressurized you right now, at exactly 60 seconds, pumped your chest, administered oxygen, restored circulation, the person who regained consciousness would be profoundly and permanently different from the person who lost it. Memory loss. Personality changes. Loss of executive function. Inability to form new memories. Paralysis. Any or all of these outcomes become probable at the 60-second mark. This is not survival. This is something else. Your heart is still beating at 60 seconds. Weakly, irregularly, the cardiac pacemaker running on its own internal electrical system even as the rest of your body fails. The heart can maintain some function for longer than the brain, because cardiac muscle is more tolerant of hypoxia than neurons. But it is failing. The blood it is pushing is more foam than fluid. The coronary arteries themselves, the vessels that supply oxygen to the heart muscle, are filling with emboli. The heart is beginning to starve itself. 60 seconds in. The point of no return has passed. 90 seconds. Your heart is losing the ability to contract effectively. The foam in the cardiac chambers cannot be pumped the way blood can. The coronary occlusions, the gas emboli blocking the arteries that feed the heart muscle itself, have been starving the myocardium for more than a minute. Cardiac arrhythmia. Irregular, ineffective contractions. Ventricular fibrillation in some sequences, the rapid disorganized quivering that produces no meaningful pumping action. The heart is becoming electrically chaotic as the hypoxia and metabolic disturbance overwhelm its conduction system. The 3 cosmonauts of Soyuz 11, Vladislav Volkov, Georgy Dobrovolsky, and Viktor Patsayev, are the only humans known to have died in space from vacuum exposure. On June 30, 1971, as their capsule was preparing to re-enter the atmosphere, A pressure equalization valve opened prematurely at 168 kilometers altitude. The spacecraft depressurized rapidly. All three were found dead in their seats when the capsule was recovered. They were not wearing pressure suits. Medical analysis of their deaths confirmed nitrogen bubbles in their blood, cerebral and pulmonary hemorrhage, and cardiac failure. Their deaths were estimated to have occurred within approximately 90 to 120 seconds of depressurization. 90 seconds in. 2 minutes. No heartbeat. No brain activity. Clinical death. The heart has stopped contracting effectively. The electrical system that drives the cardiac cycle has failed. The brain, the last neurons still firing in the brainstem, the most primitive part of the brain that controls breathing and heart rate and arousal, has now exhausted even its reserves. No pulse. No respiration. No blood flow. No electrical activity in the brain. Every cell in your body is now dying. Not the same cells that started dying at 1 minute. Those were the most vulnerable neurons in your cerebral cortex. Now it is everything. Every cell, without the oxygen and glucose that blood delivers, is transitioning from dying to dead. The cascade that began at second zero, the instant the pressure dropped, is complete. 2 minutes. That is the full duration of the most hostile environment your body will ever encounter. From the saliva boiling on your tongue at second 1 to clinical death at minute 2. That is the entire window. That is how much time you have. 2 minutes. And now let's put that in perspective. Because the window has been tested. Jim LeBlanc survived. He was exposed to near vacuum, not absolute vacuum, but 0.1 psi against his suit's 3.8 psi, for approximately 14 seconds before his colleagues could begin repressurizing the chamber. Then 87 more seconds before pressure was restored. He regained consciousness. He walked away with nothing but an earache. 14 seconds of near vacuum. Full recovery. There is also the case of a factory worker, documented in medical literature, who was accidentally exposed to industrial vacuum for approximately 3 minutes. Not space vacuum, industrial vacuum chambers can achieve pressures similar to those encountered at very high altitude. He required intensive medical care. But he eventually regained full function. 3 minutes of partial vacuum. Eventual recovery. What both of these cases tell us is that the human body, in the right circumstances, can pull back from even this. The margin is real. The window is not imaginary. But it is measured in seconds, not minutes. And it requires immediate repressurization, immediate, not after a few minutes, followed by medical care. In actual deep space, there is no repressurization. There is no medical care standing by. There is infinite vacuum in every direction and no mechanism by which the situation can be reversed. The survivors survived because another human was there immediately. In deep space, there is no one. This is what the 2-minute window really means. It means you are dependent, absolutely and completely, on the technology around you. On the suit. On the spacecraft. On the people monitoring you. On every engineering decision made by every engineer who worked on every component of every life support system between you and the void. Fail one of those things. Just one. And the countdown begins. And the countdown does not stop. Now let's flip the scenario. Let's say the suit held. Let's say the spacecraft maintained pressure. Let's say you survived the acute exposure to vacuum. You are now in deep space. Protected. Alive. Inside a spacecraft or a functional spacesuit. And deep space is still killing you. Just more slowly. The slow killers of deep space are in some ways more disturbing than the acute killers. Because they don't announce themselves. They work quietly, over days. And weeks and months, dismantling your body from the inside while you go about your daily routine, floating from module to module, eating reconstituted food, exercising on a treadmill bolted to the wall, talking to your family on a delayed video call. You feel mostly normal. A little off, maybe. Some vision issues. Some joint discomfort. Maybe some trouble sleeping. But nothing that shouts danger. Nothing that makes you stop. But here's what is actually happening inside you. Right now, sitting on Earth, you are being hit by cosmic radiation. Don't panic. The dose is tiny and your body handles it. Earth's magnetic field deflects most of the high-energy charged particles from the Sun and from galactic sources. Earth's atmosphere absorbs most of what gets through. By the time cosmic radiation reaches you at sea level, it has been filtered through the equivalent of approximately 10 meters of water worth of shielding. The dose you receive at sea level in a year is roughly 2.4 millisieverts. That is the baseline. That is normal. That is what your DNA repair mechanisms are calibrated to handle. In low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station flies, astronauts receive about 150 to 200 times that dose. Per day, an ISS astronaut receives roughly the same radiation dose as a chest X-ray. Every day. For their entire mission. 6 months on the ISS increases lifetime cancer risk by approximately 1%. That's the protected version. Inside Earth's magnetic field. With the whole of the ISS between you and the void. Beyond Earth's magnetic field, on the way to the Moon, on the way to Mars, in true deep space, that shielding is gone. And galactic cosmic rays, the most energetic radiation in the universe, are everywhere. They come from supernova explosions and neutron stars and black holes and sources we haven't fully cataloged. They travel at 90% of the speed of light. They carry energies millions of times greater than particles produced in the most powerful accelerators on Earth. And they go through everything. A galactic cosmic ray that hits your spacecraft wall doesn't just stop. When a high-energy nucleus, an iron nucleus, say, moving at near light speed, hits aluminum, it doesn't just penetrate. It shatters the aluminum nuclei it encounters, creating a shower of secondary particles. So the shield that was supposed to protect you has actually made things worse. You're now being hit by a cascade of secondary radiation instead of a single primary particle. This is called secondary radiation. And it is the reason why thick metal shielding is not the solution to the deep space radiation problem. More metal means more secondaries. The physics actively works against you. Water works better. Hydrogen-rich materials absorb energy differently, producing fewer secondary particles. But water is heavy. And in space, every kilogram costs. The most optimistic designs for a Mars spacecraft estimate you could surround the crew quarters with about 2 meters of water. That would reduce the dose somewhat. Not eliminate it. Reduce it. A round trip to Mars, accounting for 6 to 9 months each way plus about 100 days on the surface, would expose the crew to a cumulative radiation dose that increases their lifetime cancer risk by approximately 5 to 10%. But cancer is not the only thing radiation does to you in deep space. And in many ways, cancer is not the scariest thing. In 2019, researchers at the University of California, Irvine published a NASA-funded study that created one of the most unsettling data points in the entire history of space medicine. They simulated the chronic low-level radiation environment of deep space, not a single acute dose, but a continuous, low-level exposure matching what astronauts would experience on a Mars mission, and exposed mice to this environment for 6 months. Then they tested the mice's cognition, memory, and behavior. The results were alarming. The irradiated mice showed persistent impairment in spatial memory. They had trouble learning new tasks. They were less able to recognize novel objects, one of the baseline cognitive tests used to measure hippocampal function. They displayed elevated anxiety. They showed deficits in executive function, the ability to plan, adapt, and respond to unexpected situations. When researchers examined the mice's brain tissue, they found structural changes. Reduced dendritic complexity in neurons. The dendritic branches that connect neurons to each other had literally shrunk. Reduced spine density. The synaptic connections that transmit information between neurons were fewer and less robust. The physical architecture of memory and reasoning in the brain had been degraded by 6 months of chronic radiation exposure. The dose-response calculation, translating the mouse data to human risk, produced a finding that Charles Lamolli, one of the study's authors and a professor of radiation oncology at UC Irvine, described as follows: in a crew of 5 astronauts traveling to Mars and back, we would expect at least one member to display severe deficits in cognitive function by the time they return to Earth. 1 in 5. Severe cognitive deficits from the radiation alone. In a 2025 paper published in Curious, authored by John Adler of Stanford, put it more directly: space radiation is destined to mess with human brain function, and by virtue of such, defeat even the best engineered rockets and spaceships. Not damage the brain. Defeat the mission. Because the concern isn't that astronauts will come back confused. The concern is what happens to a crew during the mission, on day 400 of a 500-day journey, when a crisis occurs and someone needs to make a critical decision quickly and correctly. The astronaut with radiation-induced cognitive deficit doesn't make that decision correctly. And there is no backup. Apollo astronauts reported a different and equally disturbing radiation effect. During their transits to and from the Moon, when they were outside Earth's magnetic field for the first time, they reported seeing light flashes. Not externally. Internally. Flashes and streaks of light appearing in their visual field even in complete darkness with their eyes closed. The cause was cosmic ray particles passing through their eyes. Moving at near light speed, these particles were passing through the vitreous humor and triggering the light-sensitive cells in the retina directly. The cells fired, sent a visual signal to the brain, not because light had hit them, but because a cosmic ray had. By 2006, more than 80% of NASA and ESA astronauts who had ventured even partially outside Earth's magnetic field reported experiencing these flashes. What the long-term effects of repeated cosmic ray impacts on the retina and optic nerve are, for people spending months or years in deep space, we don't fully know yet. The honest answer from space medicine researchers is, we don't know. We don't know because no human has spent enough time in deep space yet for the full effects to manifest. The data we have is from animal models and from extrapolation. And when space medicine researchers describe the data they have, the phrase they keep using is, "The results are alarming." Here is something that surprises most people. The human body, in zero gravity, does not simply float peacefully. It does not go into some neutral, suspended state while you drift weightlessly through the void. It actively deteriorates. Systematically. In ways that accelerate the longer you are exposed. Let's start with the most obvious one. Bone loss. Your skeleton is not a static structure. It is living tissue, constantly being broken down and rebuilt in a process called remodeling. Osteoclasts, bone-dissolving cells, continually break down old bone. Osteoblasts, bone-building cells, continually lay down new bone. Under normal conditions, on Earth, these two processes are roughly in balance. Gravity, the constant stress of bearing weight, is one of the primary signals that drives osteoblast activity. Without gravitational loading, your bones receive no signal to maintain themselves. In zero gravity, osteoclast activity continues. Osteoblast activity drops. The balance shifts in one direction only. Astronauts lose up to 1.5% of their bone mass per month in zero gravity. For comparison, a postmenopausal woman not receiving treatment loses about 1% of her bone mass per year. Space accelerates that process by a factor of roughly 18. 6 months of zero gravity produces bone loss roughly equivalent to a decade of postmenopausal bone density decline. That is the time to Mars and back. The bones most affected are the weight-bearing bones, the hip, the lumbar spine, the femur. The bones most critical to standing upright, walking, functioning in the 1G environment you will return to. Astronauts who return from 6-month ISS missions have measurable bone density deficits that take years to fully recover. Some never fully recover. The NASA astronaut health records show elevated rates of fracture in former long-duration spaceflight crew. Now add radiation. Because it turns out radiation accelerates bone loss independently of gravity. The galactic cosmic rays that are passing through your body in deep space also damage bone marrow, the tissue inside your bones that produces blood cells. Radiation-damaged marrow produces fewer and less functional blood cells. And it produces less of the signaling molecules that regulate the bone remodeling process. The combination of zero gravity and deep space radiation produces bone loss that is faster and more severe than either alone. A Mars crew returning from a 2-year mission would be stepping onto Martian gravity, 38% of Earth's, with bones significantly compromised compared to when they left. And then returning to Earth's full gravity after another 6 to 9 months with bones further depleted. Bone loss is not the only skeletal issue. The spine expands in zero gravity. Without gravity compressing the intervertebral discs, they rehydrate and expand. Astronauts gain up to 3% of their height in space. This sounds harmless. It is not. The expansion of the spinal column puts the nerve roots exiting between vertebrae under increased tension. Back pain is nearly universal among astronauts. Herniated discs are significantly elevated. Here is something that no one talks about at space conferences. In zero gravity, your body fluids move upward. On Earth, gravity holds the fluid in your body preferentially toward your lower extremities. Your heart works against gravity to pump blood upward. The venous system has valves to prevent blood from pooling in your legs. Your lymphatic system drains excess fluid from your tissues in a direction that gravity assists. Remove gravity, and all of that fluid redistribution happens upward. Cephalad. Toward the head. Within the first hours of entering zero gravity, astronauts' faces swell. The moon face appearance familiar from space station photos is not cosmetic. It is fluid redistribution. The nasal passages swell. The sinuses fill. Astronauts describe a constant sensation of mild stuffiness, of congestion that never quite resolves, for the entire duration of a mission. But the redistribution is not just in the face. Cerebrospinal fluid, the clear fluid that bathes the brain and spinal cord, protecting them, nourishing them, removing waste, is also affected. On Earth, cerebrospinal fluid circulates in predictable patterns driven partly by gravity. In zero gravity, the circulation changes. The volume of CSF in the brain compartment may increase. This has a name. Spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome. SANS. And it is one of NASA's highest priority medical research concerns for long-duration missions. SANS manifests as changes to the eye, specifically changes to the back of the eye, the optic disc, and the retinal nerve fiber layer. It can cause the optic disc to swell, the eye to change shape slightly, the vision to blur. About 2/3 of astronauts on long-duration missions experience some form of SANS. Scott Kelly, the NASA astronaut who spent nearly a year on the ISS in the NASA Twins study, returned from space needing glasses for the first time in his adult life. He had not needed them before he went. The fluid redistribution had changed the geometry of his eyes. On missions to Mars, 6 months each way, the SANS would have 6 months in each direction to develop. And in the Martian gravity environment, 38% of Earth's, still significantly less than 1 g, recovery may be slower and less complete than the recovery observed after ISS missions. Whether the vision changes are reversible on very long missions, or whether they become permanent, NASA does not currently know. The astronauts on the first Mars mission will find out. Let's talk about what stands between a human being and everything we've described. The spacesuit. The Extravehicular Mobility Unit, or EMU. The thing that looks simple in photographs and is, in reality, one of the most complex machines ever built for a single person to wear. A spacesuit is not a protective garment. It is a spacecraft. Everything a spacecraft does for a crew: maintain pressure, supply oxygen, remove CO2, manage temperature, provide power, enable communication, a spacesuit does for one person, worn on their body, for up to 8 hours at a stretch. Let's go through what it actually has to do. Pressure maintenance. The suit maintains an internal pressure of approximately 4.3 psi, roughly 30% of sea-level atmospheric pressure. This is below normal atmospheric pressure, but it is well above the threshold for embolism and hypoxia if the suit is filled with pure oxygen rather than a nitrogen-oxygen mixture. At 4.3 psi with pure oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen in the suit is the entire 4.3 psi. The minimum you need for functional respiration is about 2.5 psi of oxygen partial pressure. You have margin. But 4.3 psi presents a different danger. Pure oxygen at elevated pressure is highly flammable. This was demonstrated catastrophically on January 27, 1967, when Apollo 1 astronauts Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee died in a cabin fire during a launchpad test. The command module was pressurized with pure oxygen at 16 psi, higher than atmospheric. A spark from faulty wiring ignited the cabin atmosphere. The fire spread faster than anything would burn in normal air. All 3 astronauts perished in under a minute. The lower pressure of modern suits, 4.3 psi instead of 16, reduces the fire risk substantially. Materials that won't burn in pure oxygen at 4.3 psi are available. But the suit must still be designed with absolute precision because the pressure it must maintain is the only thing preventing everything we described in Part 2 from happening immediately. A small breach. A failed seal. A crack in a glove joint. Pressure begins dropping. The countdown begins. Every astronaut on every spacewalk is aware of this. Not consciously, in the foreground of attention, that would be paralyzing, but in the trained background awareness that makes them check suit integrity at every phase, that makes them respond to any pressure anomaly as an immediate priority. Because there is no second chance. Your body has an interesting relationship with carbon dioxide. You think of it as a waste product, something you exhale, something your body wants to get rid of. And it is, at high concentrations. But at very low concentrations, CO2 is actually a crucial signal molecule that your brain uses to regulate breathing. Your respiratory drive, the automatic urge to breathe, is not triggered by low oxygen. It is triggered by rising CO2. This is why people who try to hold their breath underwater pass out eventually rather than suffocating in a peaceful, controlled way. The CO2 buildup creates a painful, overwhelming urge to breathe that cannot be resisted. And it is also why the CO2 scrubbing system in a spacesuit is one of the most critical components it contains. In a sealed suit, every breath you exhale adds CO2 to the internal atmosphere. Without scrubbing, CO2 levels would rise to toxic concentrations within minutes. At 0.5% CO2 concentration, most people notice nothing. At 1%, you may experience slight headache. At 2%, headache and cognitive slowing. At 3%, significant cognitive impairment, poor judgment, confusion. At 4 to 5%, severe headache, dizziness, approaching unconsciousness. At 7 to 10%, loss of consciousness, life-threatening emergency. Modern spacesuits scrub CO2 using lithium hydroxide canisters, canisters of chemical compound that reacts with CO2, converting it to lithium carbonate and water. The reaction is irreversible. Once saturated, the canister stops working. It cannot be regenerated in the field. It must be replaced. For a 6 to 8 hour spacewalk, the suit carries enough canister capacity to maintain safe CO2 levels. With margin. But not infinite margin. On March 23, 2023, ESA astronaut Andreas Mogensen and NASA astronaut Laurel O'Hara were conducting a spacewalk when O'Hara's suit's CO2 scrubbing system began to show anomalous readings. Mission Control evaluated the data and ultimately decided to cut the spacewalk short rather than risk allowing CO2 levels to rise. The walk was curtailed. O'Hara returned to the airlock. The decision was made by Mission Control, not the astronauts, because the astronauts, inside pressurized suits, operating in zero gravity, focused on a complex set of tasks, cannot always tell when their CO2 is rising. Early cognitive impairment from elevated CO2 presents as mild confusion, poor judgment, subtle deterioration. These are exactly the states that make self-assessment unreliable. You may not know your CO2 is too high until you can't think clearly enough to realize it. Here is something counterintuitive about wearing a spacesuit. Overheating is a bigger immediate threat than freezing. Your body generates heat. Resting metabolic rate is about 80 watts of heat output. Working hard in a suit, turning bolts, wrestling with equipment, navigating obstacles, can push that to 400 watts or more. That is the heat output of 4 or 5 bright old-style incandescent light bulbs. Continuously. Inside a sealed suit. In the vacuum of space, there is no convection and no conduction. The only heat transfer mechanism available is radiation. And radiation from a suited body at body temperature into space is slow. Not fast enough to keep up with even resting metabolic heat output. Without active cooling, a spacesuit would become an oven within minutes. The solution is a liquid cooling and ventilation garment, a piece of underwear with tubes woven through it, carrying cold water that circulates against your skin, absorbing metabolic heat, and transporting it to the suit's primary life support system where it is radiated away through heat exchangers. It works. But it is another system that can fail. In July 2013, Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano was on the second spacewalk of his career when water began accumulating in his helmet. Not sweat. Not condensation. Water. Flowing in from somewhere. Floating in zero gravity within his helmet, covering his face, accumulating around his nose and mouth. Parmitano couldn't see. He couldn't communicate clearly. Water was approaching his breathing passage. He made the decision to abort the spacewalk and navigate back to the airlock immediately, using his memory of the station layout because he couldn't see through the water in his visor. He got back. The helmet was removed. Over a liter of water was floating inside it. A leak in the suit's water cooling system had been pumping cooling water into the helmet rather than through the cooling garment. Another few minutes and Parmitano would have been drowning inside his own spacesuit in the vacuum of space. The failure was later traced to contaminated water that had clogged the filter, causing a backflow into the wrong circuit. A small engineering failure. A small piece of contamination in a filter. That is the margin. The International Space Station has walls about 3 millimeters thick. In most modules, you are separated from the vacuum of space, from everything in Part 2, by approximately 3 millimeters of aluminum composite. 1/8 of an inch. About the thickness of a pencil. At orbital velocity, roughly 17,500 miles per hour, even small debris is catastrophic. A bolt moving at that speed carries the kinetic energy of a medium-caliber rifle bullet. A paint flake the size of a thumbnail can crack a window or chip a hole. The ISS has been hit many times. There are craters and pits and chips across the external structure. Windows have been replaced. External cameras show impact damage everywhere. So far, nothing has caused a fatal breach. But there is a category of debris below about 10 centimeters in size that cannot be tracked by current radar systems. We cannot see it. We cannot predict its path. We cannot maneuver to avoid it. Objects in this size range, between about 1 centimeter and 10 centimeters, are large enough to penetrate the hull of the station and small enough that they do not appear on any tracking system. There are approximately 500,000 objects in this size range currently estimated to be in orbit around Earth. Every day the station operates, it is moving. Through this field of invisible projectiles at 17,500 miles per hour. The station has Whipple shields, layered barriers designed to shatter incoming debris into smaller fragments before they reach the hull. For objects below a certain size, the shield works. Above that size, it does not. The crew lives with this knowledge. Professionally, calmly, as a background fact of their environment. The same way people in earthquake zones live with the knowledge that the ground might move. Most days it doesn't. Someday it will. On a mission to Mars, there are no orbital debris concerns. Space between planets is far less crowded. But micrometeorites, tiny particles of rock and ice drifting through the solar system, are everywhere. And a spacecraft traveling for 6 to 9 months is a large cross-section accumulating impacts across a vast distance. The whole design for a Mars spacecraft includes Whipple shielding and redundant pressure vessels. The probability of a catastrophic hull breach in a 6-month transit is estimated to be low. Not zero. Low. In risk management, low probability multiplied by catastrophic consequence still requires mitigation. And the mitigation, better shielding, requires mass. And mass is fuel. And fuel is money. And money is finite. And so the hull is as thick as the engineers can make it within the mass budget they're given. And no one pretends that is good enough. NASA's current planning targets a crewed Mars mission sometime in the early 2030s. SpaceX's stated ambitions are more aggressive. Whichever timeline proves realistic, the mission profile is essentially this: 6 to 9 months in transit from Earth to Mars. Approximately 18 months on the Martian surface, waiting for the orbital geometry to align for the return journey, a window that opens roughly every 26 months. Then 6 to 9 months in transit back to Earth. Total mission time, approximately 2 to 3 years. 2 to 3 years in the deep space environment. Let's stack what we know about what that does. Radiation dose over 2 to 3 years beyond Earth's magnetic field. Accumulated dose sufficient to increase cancer risk by approximately 5 to 10%. Probable cognitive effects from galactic cosmic ray exposure to the brain, effects that researchers describe as persistent and potentially impairing. Under emergency conditions. Possible cataracts. Possible DNA methylation changes that may or may not resolve after return. Bone loss over 2 to 3 years in microgravity or low gravity, potentially 20 to 30% of total bone mass in the most vulnerable regions. Combined with radiation-induced bone marrow damage, the recovery timeline on return to Earth is uncertain and likely protracted. Increased fracture risk for years after return. Vision changes from SANS. 2/3 of long-duration ISS crew are affected after 6 months. 18 months of transit means 18 months for SANS to develop. Whether the changes plateau or continue to progress on longer missions is not known. Psychological effects of isolation, confinement, communication delay, and distance, we don't know the full picture. No human has experienced this specific environment. The closest analogs, Antarctic winter-over stations, submarine deployments, the Hera and Sirius isolation studies, provide some data. The data suggests that interpersonal conflict, depression, cognitive slowing, and motivation decline are common. Methods to manage them on Mars missions are still being developed. And if a medical emergency occurs, an appendicitis, a kidney stone, a broken bone, a cardiac event, the crew must handle it themselves. There is no evacuation to Earth. At minimum communication delay of 3 minutes, maximum of over 20 minutes each way. Mission Control cannot provide real-time medical guidance. The crew must diagnose and treat whatever happens with the equipment and skills they carry. The medical bay of a Mars spacecraft will need to be capable of managing everything from dental extraction to emergency surgery. With a crew of 4 to 6 people, at least one of whom will have advanced medical training but none of whom are experienced surgeons across all specialties. Every single person on that crew will be flying to a world where, if something seriously goes wrong with their body, the options range from limited to none. Surviving the journey to Mars is not the end of the danger. It is the beginning of a different kind. Mars has an atmosphere. But it is not the kind of atmosphere that helps you. The atmospheric pressure on Mars is approximately 0.6% of Earth's sea level pressure. For reference, the pressure on the summit of Mount Everest is about 33% of sea level. Mars is 55 times less pressurized than the top of Everest. Without a suit on Mars, exposure to the Martian atmosphere is functionally equivalent to vacuum exposure. The pressure is too low for your blood to maintain dissolved gases. Embolism begins. The countdown starts. The air is 96% carbon dioxide. Breathing it, if you somehow could, would cause immediate and lethal hypercapnia. CO2 poisoning. The CO2 would saturate your blood, preventing the export of cellular CO2, causing acid buildup in the blood that is incompatible with life within minutes. The surface temperature on Mars averages about -60 degrees Celsius. It can reach positive 20 degrees Celsius at the equator during summer days and plunge to negative 125 degrees Celsius at the poles in winter. The surface radiation on Mars is approximately 250 times higher than on Earth's surface. Mars has no global magnetic field. Its thin atmosphere provides minimal shielding. The radiation from galactic cosmic rays hits the surface directly. Any colonist on Mars who spends significant time on the surface without heavy shielding is accumulating radiation dose faster than any environment humans have ever inhabited on Earth. Dust storms on Mars can engulf the entire planet and last for months. During a global dust storm, sunlight reaching the surface drops by 99% in some regions. Solar panels stop generating power. Visibility drops to near zero. All surface activity must stop. The crew must survive entirely on stored resources for however long the storm lasts. The record duration for a global Martian dust storm observed by spacecraft is over 100 days. Think about what that means for a surface colony with solar power as primary energy. 100 days of minimal power. Everything on backup systems. Every non-essential system shut down to conserve energy. Cramped, cold, dark, waiting for the storm to pass. The first humans on Mars will not be explorers in the glamorous sense of exploration we imagine. They will be people who must manage survival continuously, every single day, because on Mars the default state is lethal and must be actively, constantly prevented from becoming actual. Beyond Mars, the challenges become less a matter of engineering and more a matter of physics that we don't yet know how to solve. Our nearest stellar neighbor is Proxima Centauri, part of the Alpha Centauri system. It is 4.24 light-years away. At the speed of Voyager 1, our fastest interstellar object, the journey would take approximately 73,000 years. The next candidate, Alpha Centauri A and B, the larger stars in the SIST 4.37 light-years away. Tau Ceti, thought to have potentially habitable planets in its system. Barnard's star at 5.9 light-years. All of them. To reach any of them with a human crew, in less than a human lifetime, requires speeds we currently cannot achieve. 10% of the speed of light is often cited as the minimum practical speed for interstellar travel on human timescales. At that speed, Proxima Centauri is 42 years away. Not comfortable, but possible within a career. But 10% of light speed is roughly 67 million miles per hour. Voyager 1 travels at 38,000 miles per hour. The ratio is about 1,700 to 1. We would need to go 1,700 times faster than our current fastest spacecraft. The energy required to accelerate a crewed spacecraft, with all the life support, food, water, medical equipment, and radiation shielding required for a 42-year journey to 10% of light speed is staggering. The rocket equation, the relationship between mass, fuel, and velocity change, becomes catastrophically unfavorable at these speeds with any chemical or nuclear fission propulsion. Nuclear fusion, if we could build a fusion rocket, and we haven't, might get there. Antimatter annihilation, if we could produce and store antimatter in useful quantities, and we can't, would be more efficient still. Laser-pushed light sails, the concept behind the breakthrough Starshot project, which proposes accelerating gram-scale probes to 20% of light speed using Earth-based laser arrays, cannot carry humans. The sails required are gossamer-thin structures, meters across, measuring in grams. The acceleration is achieved in minutes by laser arrays consuming terawatts of power. You cannot put a human, with all the life support they require, on a sail like that. And even if you could get there, even if you solved the propulsion problem, the interstellar medium between stars is not empty. It contains about 0.08 particles per cubic centimeter. At 10% of light speed, every hydrogen atom your spacecraft encounters has an effective kinetic energy equivalent to a cosmic ray. The impact flux on a spacecraft traveling at that speed through the interstellar medium would be tremendous. Meters of water shielding, which adds mass, which requires more energy, which requires better propulsion, which requires technology we don't have. The problem is not one obstacle. It is a chain of interconnected obstacles where solving one reveals another, each requiring capabilities that don't yet exist. Interstellar human travel is not currently impossible by the laws of physics. There is nothing in the fundamental equations of the universe that prohibits it. But the engineering gap between where we are and where we need to be is not measured in decades. It may be measured in centuries. Let's talk about Apollo 13. Because it is the best illustration we have of what happens when the engineering between you and death starts to fail. And because it happened not in deep space, not on a 6-month journey to Mars, but on a 3-day trip to the moon. The closest destination beyond Earth that any human has ever visited. April 11, 1970. 3 astronauts, Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert, launched from Kennedy Space Center on a trajectory to the moon. April 13, 1970. 2 days into the mission. 200,000 miles from Earth. During a routine stir of the oxygen tanks in the service module, an insulation fault in one tank triggered an electrical failure. The tank exploded. The explosion ruptured the second tank. Oxygen vented into space. the service module's primary power and life support systems failed. The crew had approximately 15 minutes of power remaining in the command module. They retreated to the lunar module, the two-person lander, and used it as a lifeboat. It was designed for 45 hours maximum occupancy by 2 people. They needed to use it for 87 hours with 3 people. The CO2 scrubbing canisters in the lunar module ran out. The canisters from the command module were a different shape. Square pegs and round holes. Mission Control improvised a solution using materials available on the spacecraft: a plastic bag, cardboard, duct tape, the cover of a flight manual, and radioed the instructions to the crew. Lovell and Hayes built the improvised adapter. It worked. They rationed power so severely that the temperature inside the spacecraft dropped to 3 degrees Celsius, just above freezing. They could not operate the guidance computer that would navigate the return trajectory. They used the Sun and Earth as navigation references to maintain attitude. They splashed down April 17th. All 3 survived. Let's sit with what almost happened. 200,000 miles from Earth, on the simplest possible human space mission. A fault in an electrical insulation layer. An explosion. A cascade of failures. 3 people in a lifeboat designed for 2, in a craft designed for 45 hours, for 87 hours, in the cold, rationing water, breathing increasingly contaminated air, navigating by the sun because the computers had no power. If any one of several additional small things had gone wrong, if the CO2 adapter hadn't worked, if the navigation had been slightly off, if the power had run out before they could reactivate the command module, 3 people would have died in space in 1970. On a 3-day trip to the moon. A Mars mission is over 700 days. A Mars mission cannot be resupplied. Every molecule of water, every liter of oxygen, every calorie of food the crew needs for 2 to 3 years must either be launched from Earth or produced on Mars or recycled within the spacecraft. The ISS recycles approximately 90% of water. Urine, sweat, condensation from the atmosphere, all collected, processed, and returned to drinking water quality. This is not hypothetical. It is operational. The water system on ISS is one of the engineering successes of the program. But 90% recovery means 10% loss. For a 6-month mission, 10% loss is manageable with resupply. For a 2-year Mars mission with no resupply, 10% loss is potentially mission-ending. The system needs to recover closer to 99% of all water. No water recycling system in human history has operated at 99% efficiency over 2 years in a closed environment under zero gravity with minimal maintenance capability. We are currently developing one. Food is a harder problem than water. Plants can be grown in space. NASA has grown lettuce, radishes, and other crops aboard the ISS. But the caloric requirements of a crew of 4 to 6 people over 2 to 3 years vastly exceeds what any currently demonstrated space farming system could produce in the volume available on a spacecraft. The crew will be eating primarily packaged, processed, long shelf life food for the entire mission. Packaged food degrades over time. Vitamins degrade. Caloric density may change. After 2 to 3 years, the nutritional profile of the food the crew is eating will not be what it was on day 1. Space medicine researchers have documented nutritional deficits in astronauts on long ISS missions even with regular resupply of fresh food packs. On a Mars mission, there is no fresh food resupply. And if the recycling system breaks, the water system, the air system, the CO2 scrubbing system, the crew must repair it. With the parts they brought. Without the ability to get new parts from Earth. In some cases, with no blueprint for a repair scenario because the failure mode was never anticipated. The engineering team on Earth can help. But with a communication round trip of up to 40 minutes, the crew is functionally alone in any time-critical emergency. They must think for themselves. They must solve problems that may have no precedent. They must do this while potentially compromised by radiation-induced cognitive changes, bone pain from density loss, vision impairment from SANS, and the psychological weight of knowing that the nearest human who could physically help them is 100 million miles away. This is not science fiction. This is the actual problem set that NASA and SpaceX and every other agency planning a crewed Mars mission is working on right now. The solutions exist. Partially. In development. Being tested. Getting better every year. But they are not complete yet. And the mission, in current planning, is less than 10 years away. Valery Polyakov. Russian cosmonaut. He holds the record for the longest single spaceflight in human history. 437 days. 14 months and 1 week. Aboard the Mir space station. From January 8, 1994, to March 22, 1995. He returned to Earth, stepped out of the Soyuz capsule, and walked. Barely. But he walked. He had trained obsessively on the treadmill during his mission, determined to demonstrate that a human could endure this duration in space and return functional. He walked so that the doctors who were watching knew it was possible. 437 days is approximately half the minimum duration of a Mars mission. A Mars crew will spend at least 800 days in space, most of it in transit. Possibly significantly more. Polyakov was in low Earth orbit. He could see the Earth from the window. He could talk to his family in real time. He knew that if something went badly wrong, a Soyuz could return him to Earth within hours. He was never more than a few hundred miles from home. The Mars crew will be, at their most distant, approximately 250 million miles from Earth. The communication delay will reach 20 minutes each way. The Earth, seen from that distance, will be a faint point of light, visible to the naked eye, but only barely, smaller than Venus appears from Earth. A pale blue dot barely distinguishable from the background stars. There will be a moment on the outbound journey, roughly 20 million miles from Earth, where the crew turns a corner in their relationship with home. Where Earth becomes simply one of the many points of light in the sky rather than the obvious dominant presence it is when you're in low orbit. What that does to the human psyche, we don't know. No human has ever experienced it. Space psychology researchers have identified a phenomenon they call the third quarter phenomenon. In long-duration isolated missions, Antarctic winterovers, submarine deployments, and analog space simulations, the most difficult psychological period is not the beginning and not the end. It is the third quarter. By the third quarter, the novelty is long gone. The destination is not yet close enough to feel real. Crew members are most likely to experience interpersonal conflict, depression, motivational decline, and hostility toward ground control. They call it salting. A term from submarine deployments. Crew members become hypersensitive to small annoyances that early in the mission would have been ignored. The sound of someone chewing. The way someone moves equipment. Small personality friction becomes amplified into genuine resentment. On a mission where the crew cannot leave, where there is no isolation space beyond a toilet cubicle, where the same 5 or 6 faces are the only human faces you see for 2 to 3 years, interpersonal conflict is not just unpleasant. It is mission-threatening. The most extreme documented case in analog space research was the Mars 500 study in 2010 to 2011 in Moscow. 6 crew members spent 520 days in an isolation facility simulating a Mars mission. The results were sobering. 1 crew member showed clinical signs of depression. Another developed severe sleep disruption. The entire crew showed marked reductions in physical activity as the mission progressed. Communication with mission control became strained. And this was on Earth. With the ability to end the experiment at any moment. With sunlight coming through the building windows. With emergency support. Seconds away if someone genuinely broke. On a real Mars mission, there is no ending the experiment. Space agencies are developing psychological countermeasures. Training. Conflict resolution protocols. Mission scheduling designed to avoid boredom. Regular communication with psychologists. Private communication channels with family. Careful crew selection and crew compatibility testing. These interventions help. They are not sufficient. Because the core problem is not resolvable by psychology. The core problem is that human beings are not adapted for 800 days of confinement with 5 people in a vessel roughly the size of a large bus, 100 million miles from every other human who has ever existed, in an environment where a dozen single points of failure could kill them all in under 2 minutes. No amount of training can make that normal. Because it isn't normal. It is the most abnormal thing a member of our species has ever voluntarily agreed to do. And someone has to do it first. And that person, whoever they are, will go in knowing all of this. And will go anyway. Because that is also something human beings do. That is also part of what we are. We have spent this time walking through what deep space does to your body. Second by second. System by system. Layer by layer. We did it not to frighten you. We did it because the opposite of fear is not ignorance. The opposite of fear is understanding. And understanding what deep space actually is, what it takes from the human body, what it destroys without negotiation, what it simply does not care about, creates something that doesn't come from anywhere else. It creates an accurate picture of what Earth is. Not a given. Not a background. Not a stage for human drama that will always be there, patient and permanent, while we focus on the drama. Earth is the only place in the known universe where you can exist without every single process keeping you alive being actively managed by technology that must function perfectly every second. It is the only address in the cosmos where the pressure is right, and the temperature is right, and the radiation is filtered, and the gravity is calibrated to the skeleton you've been growing since before you were born. The atmosphere is 1 inch of air. From the outside, looking in. 1 inch of molecular shield between you and radiation that would destroy your DNA within hours. The magnetic field is invisible. You will never see it or feel it or perceive its presence in any sensory way. But right now, at this moment, it is deflecting high-energy particles that would otherwise be passing through your brain and leaving ion trails of damage through your neurons. Every breath you have ever taken has been filtered. Every temperature you have ever felt has been modulated. Every moment of protection you have ever had from the hostility of the universe has been provided, automatically and completely, by a planet that has been building and maintaining these systems for 4.5 billion years. That is what Earth is. Not a rock. Not a location. Not a coordinate in space. The only confirmed address in the universe compatible with the existence of you. And deep space is everything else. Everything else. Your saliva boiling on your tongue at second 1. The bubble of consciousness narrowing at second 10. The clock stopping at minute 2. That is not the story of something that happens to other people somewhere far away. That is the story of what the universe looks like to your body everywhere except here. The suit, the spacecraft, the engineering of the engineers who built the engineering, all of it, from the heat tiles on the nose of the shuttle to the O-ring on a valve, from the water recycling membrane and the life support system to the lithium hydroxide canister in the suit backpack, all of it is the physical, engineered answer to one question. How do we keep a body that belongs on Earth alive somewhere that it doesn't? The answer is, with extraordinary difficulty. At enormous cost. With constant attention. And with the knowledge, always, that one small thing going wrong starts a countdown that has an end. 2 minutes. That is the window. That is the margin. That is what makes the astronauts who go anyway either the bravest humans who have ever lived or the most extraordinary, or both. And that is what makes every moment you spend here, on this pressurized, magnetically shielded, atmospherically filtered, gravitationally calibrated, beautifully ordinary planet, something other than ordinary. It is, from a universal perspective, something extremely rare. Something that only exists in one place that we know of. And you are standing in it right now. Good night. And the next time you breathe without thinking about it, think about it. Just once.